Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can take a look at the mental health and personality factors that may have been at work in the Kent Leppink case. So this is a murder case, and originally 2 people were convicted of this murder, a man named John Carlin and a woman named Mechele Linehan. So this brings me to some other questions about Mechele Linehan. Was she actually not guilty? Like, again, she was released from prison. Should she have been released in terms of true guilt or innocence? And does she have some sort of special power where she can manipulate men easily? So just a reminder that I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. So first I'll take a look at the crime, the timeline of the murder, then the investigation and the trial, and then take a look at the mental health and personality factors, including the guilt of Mechele Linehan. Was she guilty or not guilty? And this theory about her power over men. So starting with the crime, we have to go back to May 2, 1996 in Hope, Alaska. This is a small fishing village about 90 miles from Anchorage, Alaska. The body of a man named Kent Leppink is found. He's a 36-year-old commercial fisherman, and he was shot 3 times with a .44 caliber Desert Eagle. He was shot once in the back, once in the abdomen, and once in the head. It was believed that Kent was murdered sometime between midday on April 30 and in the early morning on May 2. So the police had some additional evidence other than the body of the victim. They see that Kent sent a letter to his family before he was murdered. The letter had instructions indicating that it should only be read in the event that Kent died. In the letter, he wrote that if he should die under suspicious circumstances, then a man named John Carlin III, a woman named Michelle Hughes, or a man named Scott Hilke were likely involved in his death. So really he had all 3 of them in there as potential suspects. At one time, Michelle Hughes, a 23-year-old exotic dancer, and John Carlin, who was 39, had shared a residence with Kent for several months. Kent identified Michelle as his fiancée. The police interviewed both Michelle and John. Michelle was at Lake Tahoe with Scott at the time of the murder. Evidently the trip was her idea. She said she just wanted to have a few quiet days together. The couple was actually broken up at that time, so that's interesting. The police could not find enough evidence connecting John to the murder either, although they did have 2 pieces of evidence that would become important later on. There was a life insurance policy on Kent with Michelle as the beneficiary, and we see there was a note found in Kent's car, suggesting that Michelle was staying in a cabin in Hope, Alaska. The police believe that this letter was used to lure Kent to that area so that John could murder him. As it turns out, that cabin that was referenced in the letter did not exist. In 2004, the police decided to take another look at the case. Not long after they reopened the investigation, in 2005, they used a common, simple police tactic to pressure John Carlin's son into implicating his father. He was 17 at the time of the murder. They essentially said to him that they already knew John was involved in the murder, right? So he didn't have any experience talking to the police, so he started revealing information he knew right away. His son told investigators that John Carlin purchased a .44 caliber Desert Eagle after seeing it advertised in the newspaper. John Carlin had previously denied owning a firearm. Now, the son also indicated that he saw John cleaning a firearm in chemicals in a sink right after the murder, but he couldn't be sure if the gun in the sink was the Desert Eagle. Now, using new technology, the police recovered several emails that had been deleted, so they had new information in 2004 that they did not have when the investigation originally took place. These emails implicated Michelle and John. Then, of course, they still had the note I mentioned and that insurance policy information. The police speculated that the motive for the murder for both Michelle and John was that insurance policy. Now, just 5 days before Kent died, he changed the policy so that the beneficiary was his father. John had another motivator beyond just the money. This would be that he wanted to be with Michelle. He wanted to marry her. He wanted to have her all to himself. So essentially, Kent was a competitor for Michelle's affection, right? So he had multiple motives, whereas Mechele was thought just to have the one motive. In 2006, arrest warrants were issued for both Mechele and John. Mechele had moved to Olympia, Washington, and married a physician. She had changed her name to Mechele Linehan. She also earned a master's degree in public administration and was well respected in her community. Both Mechele and John were arrested and brought back to Anchorage, Alaska. Now moving to the trials, I'm going to focus more on Mechele Linehan's trial. We see that John was tried first. He was found guilty and sentenced to 99 years. He was eligible for parole after 33 years. Now, in that trial with John, Mechele Linehan was actually a major focus. There were a few times where it didn't even seem like John was involved at all in the proceedings. So there was a lot of emphasis on this conspiracy that allegedly existed between Mechele and John. Mechele was tried after John was convicted. During this trial, we see a lot of interesting evidence and testimony. It was a circumstantial case, just like what we saw with John. There was nothing like DNA, video, eyewitnesses, nothing that directly connected Mechele to the homicide. So let's take a look at the evidence. The prosecution, of course, had that note that Kent wrote suggesting that Mechele and John were responsible if he were killed. Kent knew that Mechele was in a romantic relationship with John and Scott, but he refused to give up on that relationship. So Kent was infatuated with Mechele. This meant that Mechele could easily exploit Kent. We see evidence suggesting Mechele was manipulating Kent in the context of their romantic relationship. She was stringing him along and didn't really love him. In the recovered emails, Mechele indicated to Kent that she wanted to marry him, yet in other emails to her mother, she indicated she had no intention of doing that. The emails indicated she was stringing along John Carlin and Scott Hilke as well. Then we see this email that Mechele sent to John. Now, he didn't reply to this, where she was talking about a place where they could move, where there was no extradition treaty with the United States. So that looked fairly suspicious. A former coworker of Mechele's testified that Mechele and her watched the movie The Last Seduction. In this movie, a woman convinces her physician husband to sell cocaine. She took the proceeds from that sale and went to a small town. She then convinced a man she met in a bar to kill her husband for the insurance money. In the end, he went to prison and she was never caught. After the film, the witness said that Mechele indicated she wanted to be just like the protagonist in the movie. Interestingly, the witness kept a diary of all the movies that she watched, yet she couldn't find an entry for that movie. Now, Kent's lawyer testified that on April 26, so 1 week before the body was discovered, Kent told him that Mechele had left. She had allegedly stolen a computer, a few rugs, and an expensive bronze statue. Kent's mother testified that Kent called her and said that he was driving to Hope, Alaska to search for Mechele. She tried to talk him out of it, but he said he was going to do it anyway. And of course, there was the testimony of John Carlin's son about seeing his dad cleaning the gun. But interestingly, on 2 separate occasions, he told the police that his dad was alone at that time. Mechele Hughes, as she was known then, was not there. October 22, 2007, Mechele Linehan is convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 99 years in prison. She was 35 at this time, and she would not be eligible for parole until she was 68. In 2008, John Carlin was murdered in prison. His estate continued an appeal that he was working on, and they won. The letter that Kent had written that said that John could be a suspect if he was murdered, that was thrown out. His murder conviction was overturned. Of course, as he was already dead, the timing was less than ideal. February 2010, Mechele's conviction is overturned. The court did this because they found 2 pieces of evidence that were used against her should not have been used against her. One of those items was, of course, the letter, the same letter that was thrown out in John Carlin's appeal. The second item was the testimony about Mechele's unusually high interest in the movie The Last Seduction. In May, a new trial was ordered, and Mechele was released on bond. December 2011, a judge dismissed the indictment against Mechele. The ruling was that the grand jury had heard inadmissible evidence. The prosecution would have to convene a new grand jury and start over if they wanted an indictment. While all this was happening, Mechele's attorneys discovered new evidence. They found that the prosecution had failed to disclose that after the murder, a few of Kent's family members had approached the prosecution It said that Kent's father was involved in the murder. Evidently, Kent Leppink had embezzled money from the family business. He had also borrowed tens of thousands of dollars. Kent's father was in Alaska during the time of the murder. Additionally, they found that the lead investigator was in the process of writing a book on the case, which he was attempting to sell to a publisher. When this evidence was presented, the prosecution decided not to seek a new indictment. So now moving to the mental health and personality factors at work in a case like this, and looking at the questions, was Mechele Linehan guilty, and did she have a special power over men? Now, at one point before the murder, Mechele was engaged to Kent, John, and Scott, all at the same time. All three of them were her fiancés. Evidently, each of them knew about the other two. Even still, they gave her jewelry and other gifts, as well as cash. Mechele admitted during her trial that she manipulated them to get what she wanted. So at least during that time, we see that Mechele was manipulative, she lacked empathy, there was pathological lying, and superficial charm. All three of the men demonstrated that they were obsessed with her, although the level of obsession was much higher for Kent and John. They really couldn't let go of the fantasy. Kent couldn't see what was going on in reality here. When he started to realize that he wasn't going to get what he wanted, we see all this odd behavior, like writing the letter suggesting who would have murdered him, and repeatedly trying to track down Mechele, driving to Hope, Alaska twice. It's like he knew he was in danger, but couldn't bring himself to let go of the fantasy. Now, we see a while before this that Mechele and Scott had traveled to Louisiana, and Kent had followed them there, and I guess met up with them, and at one point even served them breakfast in bed. And when he made those trips to Hope, Alaska, he carried a picture of Mechele Linehan around and showed the residence. So it's clear he was desperately searching for her. He was really trying to, again, kind of connect with the fantasy. Now, John was a little bit different. I think he believed that he and Mechele were playing Kent together, like they were on the same team against Kent. Here we see someone who thinks they are capable of manipulation, who lacks empathy, who's fixated on fulfilling his desires, and who demonstrates pathological lying. He was also insecure. This drove him to want to get Kent out of the picture. He wanted to feel safe. I think it was probably his idea to murder Kent. So, did John Carlin commit the murder? I think he did. On top of all the evidence we see presented at his trial, he admitted something later on when he was in prison that I think was actually crucial. He admitted that he owned a .44 caliber Desert Eagle, and he thought it was probably the murder weapon. That's a really strange statement to make if someone was innocent. Now, he said that the weapon disappeared during the time that the murder took place, only to magically reappear in his closet after the murder. He also said that Mechele could not have been the one who shot Kent. So somebody who had no motive to kill Kent decided to sneak in to their residence, to John and Mechele's residence, steal this pistol, evidently they didn't take anything else, commit a murder with it, and then bring it back and put it in the closet. This is what he wanted people to believe. So that covers John. Was Mechele guilty? Well, let's look at this in two ways. I'll look at this in terms of the law, so guilty versus not guilty, and I'll also look at this in terms of logic. Either somebody is guilty or innocent, right? So kind of absent from the law. So when looking at legal guilt, somebody is either guilty or not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Not guilty doesn't mean innocent. So under this standard, I think that she was not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt because John could have acted alone, and this seems somewhat likely. He could have told her to get that insurance policy, but not specified why. It does seem like she knew something was going on, but there's a reasonable doubt that she was an active conspirator in the murder. And that was what she was charged with. She was charged with murder. If she was charged with something else, that would be a whole different situation. But they're saying that she was a conspirator in this killing. If the prosecution had a case after her conviction was overturned, they would have indicted her. They did not have enough to meet their burden. Now, what about a situation of guilt and innocence? So truly being guilty and truly being innocent. I would say here that she was probably guilty. Even though the letter was thrown out, so it was not valid for a legal proceeding, it does strongly point to guilt. Unless Ken arranged to have somebody kill him and frame John and Mechele, which I think is pretty unlikely. Some people say that Mechele could not have been guilty because she had such a productive life after the murder occurred. I think the reality is that a number of people who are currently in prison for murder would lead a productive life if they were released. So this really can't be a standard that's applied. We can't look at somebody who gets away with murder and then look at their life and say, oh, they did okay, so they must not have committed that murder, right? So she was probably quite immature and, again, manipulative, and she was doing things that she would not do later in her life. If Mechele was in fact guilty, this situation is eerily similar to the plot of The Last Seduction, in the sense that she got away with it. Kent and John are both dead, and she's free. With the conviction overturned, she doesn't even have a criminal record. So other than some time in prison, which I'm sure was stressful, she really did get away with murder. Again, that's if she's guilty. Now, whether or not she is actually guilty or innocent, her behavior contributed to the destruction of 2 lives, and all the family members of those people. I don't think her behavior of manipulating men is extremely unusual among exotic dancers, but pulling other people into her daily life, like pulling these 3 men into her daily life, living with them in the same house, taking money and gifts over an extended period of time, promising to marry them, she really got too involved here. She took the manipulation to a higher level. So it wasn't just reckless, it was really extremely dangerous. So what about this question about her power over men? Well, this is something that really surprised a lot of people. We saw a lot of discussion by the prosecution. They just seemed amazed that all these men were willing to bend over backwards for Mechele. We see in that letter that Kent wrote to his family that he talked about how he wanted Mechele prosecuted for his murder, but he also told them to visit Mechele in prison and tell her how much he loved her. Right? So even as he's contemplating his own homicide by Mechele, he wants to communicate after death that he was really just head over heels for her. He wanted her to know that. We also see that he talks about Mechele having a split personality. And this is how it would seem to someone who does not understand this type of person, right? So from his perspective, it seemed like she was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He couldn't understand how she could be loving and caring one moment, or seem that way, and be cold and manipulative in another moment. Now, it wasn't only Ken. We see the other 2 fiancés were obviously quite taken with Mechele. We see that when she was eligible for bond after her conviction was overturned, that a individual not related to her put up $25,000 against the $250,000 bond. So 10% is lost. So that $25,000 was gone so that Mechele could make that $250,000 bond. He just gave it to her. Now, I don't know anything about him. It just seems like an odd thing to do. Kind of out of nowhere, give a stranger $25,000. Now, another man who owned a hotel also offered to help her by putting up his hotel as collateral. Now, the judge didn't allow this, but he was willing to give up that hotel because if she had skipped bail, the state would have taken that from him. We also see that she is married to a physician, and he went bankrupt trying to pay her legal bills. Now, that's her husband, so that's a little bit different. He might be very committed to her regardless of whether there's some type of manipulation going on or not. And of course, I don't know what's going on with that relationship. At the time of making this video, it's my understanding that the 2 work together, but they're separated. So we see all these men who may or may not have been manipulated by Mechele. And again, a lot of people looking at this, and they're kind of surprised. How is this possible? Does she have some sort of special power that other women do not have? Well, I think what happens here is the men allowed themselves to just run away with the fantasy. And this took away pain and gave them a sense of euphoria. It's like a drug. This was really a case of logical thinking versus emotional reasoning, where logical thinking loses terribly, right? Emotional reasoning really won in this situation. When somebody has all emotional reasoning and no logic, the behavior almost seems delusional. And I think that's what we really see here, something that mirrors delusional behavior. I don't know if it was delusional or not. It certainly seemed that way in the case of Kent and John. But either way, these individuals were kind of not worrying about reality, right? They were, again, kind of highly invested in this fantasy world, and they did not want that fantasy to end. Now, it's important to remember that there are a wide variety of reactions to somebody like Mechele. These men, of course, were really taken with her, but I think many men would have just said, no thanks. They're not going to give her money, not going to give her jewelry. They just would have walked away, especially when she had the multiple fiancés. But there's always a small percent of the population that is gullible, that needs the excitement, that needs the fantasy. They need to believe in something that's unrealistic. And these individuals are highly vulnerable to someone like Mechele. Sometimes when a person is obsessed with another, we hear this phrase that they're willing to die for them and willing to kill for them. And in this case, with Mechele Linehan, we really see both. It would seem that at some level, Kent was willing to die, and certainly it would seem that John was willing to kill. I know whenever I talk about murder cases, there will be a variety of opinions. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be interesting. Thanks for watching.